Two racist police officers burn down a black man's business and then laugh about it in his face. However, in the end, the black man gets the last laugh. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Benny's Grill, a modest but well-loved fast food joint nestled on the corner of a quiet street in a small southern town. Benny Carter wiped down the counter, his eyes occasionally drifting to the framed photo of his daughter, beaming from her 5th grade graduation, which he kept by the register. He had put everything into this place, pouring every spare dollar, every minute of his time, to build Benny's Grill up from the ground. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. As he grabbed a rag to clean the tables, the chime above the door rang. Benny looked up, and his stomach dropped. 2 police officers had stepped inside, their eyes already scanning the place with looks that made his throat tighten. The taller of the two, a thick-set man with a close-cropped haircut, approached the counter with an almost lazy confidence. Benny recognized him. Officer Rick Thompson, a local name he'd heard muttered around the community, often in warning. The other officer, a wiry man with a mustache, trailed a few steps behind, his eyes darting around as if they were already suspicious of what they might find. "Benny Carter?" Thompson asked, his voice as cold as the gray in his eyes. "That's me," Benny replied, his voice even, though he felt his hands tighten around the rag he was holding. He tried not to let his nerves show, but something about their expressions made his stomach churn. He'd been through this before, too many times, really. Thompson's lips curled into a smirk as he surveyed the place. "Got a tip about some suspicious activity going on here." He dragged out the words, his eyes flicking to Benny with a trace of amusement that did not belong. "Said you might have something illegal in the back. Thought we'd take a look around." Benny's heart skipped a beat. This was his place, his livelihood, and they were treating it like a crime scene. He glanced toward the back, where his kitchen sat clean and ready for the dinner crowd. There was nothing to hide, but the way they were looking at him, he knew it wouldn't matter if his kitchen sparkled. They had already decided what they'd find. "Look," Benny began, keeping his voice steady, "there's nothing back there but food and cooking supplies. You're welcome to look around if you think there's an issue, but there's nothing suspicious here." The second officer, Chad Anderson, chuckled under his breath, exchanging a glance with Thompson. "A little jumpy, aren't we?" he muttered, though loud enough for Benny to hear. It was meant to needle him, make him squirm, and Benny knew it. Benny's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to keep his voice calm. "Not jumpy. Just confused why you're here." "Uh-huh." Thompson's smirk widened, as if Benny's attempt at reason was somehow funny to him. "We'll be the judge of that. You just hang out here at the counter while we go check the back. Don't go wandering off." Benny watched, helpless and frustrated, as the 2 officers strode past him without another word, heading straight for the kitchen. He stood there for a moment, frozen with disbelief and an anger that was getting harder to ignore. He'd never felt comfortable around guys like Thompson and Anderson, officers who didn't seem to need a reason to think the worst of him. He'd grown up seeing men like them around town, always keeping an eye on people like him. The sound of metal clattering in the back snapped Benny out of his thoughts. He strained to hear more, trying to tell himself they were just moving things around, but the noise only grew louder, a series of loud thuds and clangs that sounded more like destruction than any search. The knot in his stomach tightened. The banging didn't stop. He could hear Thompson's voice, low and taunting, though he couldn't make out the words. Every instinct told him to stay put, to avoid making this worse, but as he heard more crashing and clattering, his patience finally snapped. They were tearing apart his kitchen, and he couldn't just stand by. Benny moved from behind the counter, his steps quick and determined. When he reached the kitchen door, he stopped, taking in the mess they were making. Thompson was pulling trays off the shelves, tossing them to the floor without a care. Anderson, who had been rifling through the supply cabinets, had tipped over a cart of ingredients as if it were nothing. "Hey!" Benny shouted, his voice bouncing off the tile walls. "What the hell are you doing?" Thompson turned slowly, a glint of amusement in his eyes as he took in Benny's expression. "Didn't we tell you to stay out front?" he said, his voice low and mocking. He crossed his arms, looking Benny up and down like he was nothing more than a nuisance. "Yeah, but I didn't say you could tear up my place." Benny's voice trembled with anger, his hands clenching as he took a step forward. But Anderson moved quickly, positioning himself between Benny and Thompson, his hand resting lightly on his holster. "We're just being thorough," Thompson replied coolly. "Gotta make sure nothing's hiding under all this clutter." He gestured to the mess they'd made with a smug grin that made Benny's skin crawl. Benny's pulse raced, the frustration building with every second he stood there. He forced himself to speak calmly, though it took everything he had. You've seen there's nothing here. This is my business, my livelihood, and you're tearing it apart for no reason. Thompson raised an eyebrow, the mocking tone never leaving his voice. Funny, you don't look so innocent. And people who don't cooperate usually have something to hide. Ain't that right, Anderson? Anderson chuckled, a dry, humorless laugh. Sure is. It's almost like he doesn't want us to find something, he added, looking Benny up and down with a contemptuous sneer. Benny gritted his teeth, the words sticking in his throat. He knew better than to argue, to give them any reason to push him further, but watching them destroy what he'd worked for with nothing but smugness in their expressions made it near impossible to hold his tongue. Look, Benny said, managing to keep his voice even. I don't want any trouble. Just get what you need and go, please. Thompson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Maybe we're not done here yet. Maybe we need to be a little more thorough. With that, Thompson motioned for Anderson, who grabbed Benny by the arm and yanked him back, pushing him toward the counter with unnecessary force. Benny stumbled, catching himself just in time, anger flashing in his eyes as he looked at the officer. You heard the man back out front, Anderson said, his tone hard, leaving no room for discussion. Benny's mind raced with everything he wanted to say, every protest he wanted to make. But he could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken threat in their eyes, warning him to keep his place. Reluctantly, he let them shove him back toward the counter, where he stood in silence, fists clenched as the crashing and banging continued. The sounds from the kitchen seemed louder now, each crash and clatter twisting the frustration inside him. It wasn't just the mess they were making, it was the disregard, the way they acted as though they had the right to ruin his life's work without a second thought. Benny took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, but the frustration simmered just below the surface. Every second stretched out, every sound from the kitchen a fresh reminder of how powerless he felt. Benny stood by the counter, listening as each crash and clang echoed from the kitchen. Every sound seemed like a deliberate taunt, a way to remind him that they were in control. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter with every second, his mind racing with frustration, disbelief, and an anger he could barely contain. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes, he couldn't take it anymore. His business, his life's work was in that kitchen, and they were tearing it apart. He knew what they were trying to do, trying to break his spirit, make him feel like he had no control. But he couldn't just stand by and watch. He took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen, his steps heavier with determination this time. When he pushed open the door, he froze, taking in the mess they had made. It was worse than he'd thought. Storage bins lay overturned. Food and ingredients spilled across the floor. Trays scattered like trash. His carefully organized supplies, the inventory he'd spent hours restocking just yesterday, were strewn across the counters, some of it smashed and wasted. Thompson glanced up from the fridge, where he'd been pulling out bins and tossing them aside without a care. He straightened up when he saw Benny, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't we tell you to stay up front?" Thompson's voice dripped with mockery, his tone making it clear he'd been expecting Benny to break. "I told you," Benny said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "There's nothing here, just my restaurant, my kitchen, my property, and you're treating it like a dumpster. What gives you the right?" Thompson stepped forward, crossing his arms and looking down at Benny with a gaze that held not an ounce of respect. "Right? Oh, we've got all the right we need. We got a tip, didn't we, Anderson?" He tilted his head toward his partner. Anderson, who was rifling through a stack of receipts Benny had kept in a folder, chuckled without looking up. "Sure did. Must have been some real bad stuff for someone to call us out here." His voice was casual, as though tearing apart Benny's business was just another part of the day. Benny felt his hands ball into fists. He forced himself to unclench them, focusing on keeping his voice steady. "You're not finding anything because there's nothing to find. You're wrecking my place for nothing, and you know it. If you got a call, then it was a lie." Thompson's smirk grew, a spark of amusement lighting in his eyes. "Now, that's funny. People don't usually get this riled up when they're innocent. If you had nothing to hide, you wouldn't be getting so worked up, would you?" Benny's breath caught in his throat, his pulse racing as he fought to keep his voice calm. "I'm getting worked up because you're treating me and my place like garbage for no reason, just because you can." Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a harder, colder look. He stepped closer, his face just inches from Benny's. "Now listen here. We can do what we need to as long as we're acting on a tip. And you don't get to tell us how to do our job." Benny stood his ground, refusing to back down, even though every instinct told him that pushing back would only make things worse. And destroying my kitchen, trashing my property, that's part of your job. It is when we think someone's hiding something, Anderson interjected, his voice calm but laced with condescension. People like you don't usually get a lot of sympathy when things get messy. The words stung, and Benny felt a flare of anger so strong he could barely see straight. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching him snap. Instead, he met Thompson's gaze, refusing to let his fear show. "This is my place," Benny said, his voice low but firm. "And I'm telling you, there's nothing here. You've seen that. Now, if you're done—" Thompson interrupted with a harsh laugh. "If we're done, we'll be done when we say we're done." He gestured to the mess they'd made. "And maybe, just maybe, you ought to think twice before getting mouthy with officers of the law. People who don't cooperate, well, they usually have something to hide." Benny could feel his control slipping. He took a step back, struggling to find the words to express the anger and helplessness he felt. "This is harassment," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're harassing me for no reason, and you know it." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Harassment? You think just because you're getting a little inspection, you're being targeted? Maybe we'd be less inclined to look around if you weren't so defensive," Anderson snorted, shaking his head. "You know, you people always have a way of turning things around to make yourselves the victim." Benny's heart pounded in his chest, anger and frustration mixing with a sickening sense of dread. He knew this was pointless. He knew there was no reasoning with them. But he couldn't just let them destroy everything he'd worked for without saying something. "Get out," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You've had your look. Now leave." Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Is that right? You think you can tell us what to do?" He exchanged a look with Anderson, who shrugged, then gave Benny a hard shove, sending him stumbling back. Benny caught himself, glaring at the two officers as they laughed. He wanted to shout, to curse, but he knew that would only give them more reason to escalate. Instead, he forced himself to take a deep breath, keeping his anger just below the surface. "Fine," he said, gritting his teeth. "You want to search? Search. But I'm not staying out here while you destroy my place." Thompson's face hardened, his voice dropping to a deadly tone. "Listen, Carter. We're giving you one last chance to cooperate. You don't want to make this harder on yourself. Trust me." Benny clenched his fists. "You're already making it hard enough, but I'm not moving until you stop tearing this place apart." Thompson smirked, looking over at Anderson with a smug grin. "Well, sounds like we got a little situation here, don't we, Anderson?" "Sure does," Anderson replied, reaching for his handcuffs with a mocking sigh. "Seems like someone doesn't know how to follow directions." Before Benny could react, Anderson had grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back and locking the cuffs around his wrists with a painful snap. Benny's anger flared, but he bit back any protests, knowing it would only give them more fuel. "Let's take this outside," Thompson said, gripping Benny's shoulder and steering him toward the front door. "You're going to cool off on the curb while we finish up here." As they dragged him out to the sidewalk, Benny's mind raced, anger and helplessness blending into a cold, simmering rage. He glanced back at his restaurant, his heart sinking as he took in the mess they'd left behind. He had no choice but to wait, standing handcuffed outside his own business as they continued their search inside, feeling the weight of each insult they'd thrown at him, the disrespect, and the mess they had made of his world. Benny stood outside, his hands cuffed behind his back, as he stared at the front of his restaurant, his stomach churning with anger and helplessness. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the street. It was quiet out here. The town's evening bustle hadn't yet begun, but inside Benny's grill, the officers were continuing their so-called search as if they had all the time in the world. Officer Anderson leaned casually against the wall beside him, watching him with an expression that was somewhere between boredom and amusement. Every so often, Anderson would glance toward the kitchen door where Officer Thompson was still rummaging through Benny's supplies and chuckle softly under his breath. "You know," Anderson said, his voice low and taunting, "you'd think you'd have better things to do than get yourself in trouble like this." Benny gritted his teeth, refusing to take the bait. He kept his gaze fixed on the front of his restaurant, the place he'd built from nothing. Every fiber of his being wanted to lash out, to tell Anderson exactly what he thought of him and his partner. But he knew that would only make things worse. "Nothing to say," Anderson continued, crossing his arms as he leaned in close. "I thought you'd be a little more vocal, seeing as how you had so much to say back there." Benny clenched his fists behind his back, keeping his voice steady as he spoke. "I'm just waiting for you to finish tearing my place apart so I can get back to work." Anderson snorted, shaking his head. "Work? Is that what you call this place?" He looked at the building with disdain, as if the thought of Benny owning anything was laughable. Benny turned away, focusing on keeping his anger in check. But then he heard it, a faint sound from inside the restaurant, a strange crackling noise that sent a chill down his spine. He strained to listen, his heart racing as the sound grew louder. A moment later, Thompson came stumbling out of the kitchen, his face red and panicked. Benny felt a sinking feeling in his gut as Thompson shouted, "Anderson, Anderson, we got to go." Anderson straightened up, his casual demeanor vanishing as he looked toward his partner. Benny twisted around, straining to see inside the restaurant. His breath caught in his throat as he saw it. Thick, dark smoke was beginning to pour from the kitchen doorway, curling out into the dining area. What did you do?" Benny's voice was barely a whisper, his heart pounding as he watched the smoke spread. Thompson ignored him, grabbing Anderson by the arm and pulling him toward the street. "Forget it, we're out of here," he barked, casting a quick glance back at the restaurant before hurrying away. Benny's mind reeled, his thoughts racing in disbelief. His restaurant, his life's work, was on fire, and the two officers who had spent the past hour tearing it apart were running away without a second thought. The smell of burning plastic and wood filled the air, sharp and suffocating, and Benny felt a wave of desperation rise up inside him. He struggled against the cuffs, pulling at his wrists as he shouted after them, "Help me put it out, my place is burning!" But neither Thompson nor Anderson looked back. They were already several yards away, moving quickly down the sidewalk as if they couldn't leave fast enough. Benny's heart pounded as he watched them go, feeling the full weight of his helplessness pressing down on him. Around him, people had begun to gather, drawn by the smoke billowing from the restaurant. Some of them glanced at Benny with confusion or pity, but none moved to help. He saw a few people pull out their phones, filming the scene as the fire grew, the flames licking at the walls and spreading rapidly. "Somebody, please," Benny shouted, his voice hoarse as he turned toward the small crowd. "Call the fire department." Finally, a woman in the crowd took out her phone, dialing 911 with a look of horror on her face. Benny watched as she spoke to the operator, relief and dread washing over him in equal measure. The fire department was on its way, but he knew it would be too late to save his restaurant. As he stood there, helplessly watching his life go up in flames, he noticed Thompson and Anderson in the distance, standing near their squad car. They were talking quietly, their faces turned away from the fire, but Benny could see them laughing. They glanced back toward him briefly, smirking as if they were sharing some private joke. Benny felt his blood boil, his rage bubbling over as he realized they didn't care. They hadn't even tried to put out the flames. They were laughing, treating his loss as nothing more than an inconvenience or a source of entertainment. He wanted to shout, to scream, to make them understand the damage they'd caused, but the words stuck in his throat. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and fire trucks pulled up to the scene. Firefighters rushed to contain the blaze, their hoses spraying arcs of water over the burning building, but Benny knew it was too late. The flames had already spread too far, consuming everything inside. A firefighter approached him, his expression sympathetic as he took in the scene. "Sir, are you the owner?" Benny nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yep, I'm the owner, or I was." The firefighter looked back at the building, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. We'll do our best, but it doesn't look good." Benny swallowed hard, forcing himself to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. He felt numb, hollowed out, as he watched the firefighters work to put out the flames. The place he had built with his own hands, the business he had poured his heart and soul into, was gone, reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes. As he stood there, he overheard a voice nearby. It was Thompson, speaking in a low tone to Anderson. "Guess that search got a little heated," he said with a smirk, chuckling as if he'd made some kind of joke. Anderson laughed, his voice equally cold. "Accidents happen," he replied, glancing back at the smoking remains of Benny's grill. "Shame, though. I'm sure the insurance'll cover it, if he's lucky." The words sliced through Benny, filling him with a rage so intense he could barely think. He took a step toward them, his fists clenched, and his breath coming in short, furious bursts. "You did this," he said, his voice low but laced with fury. "You burned down my place and you're standing there laughing about it." Thompson shrugged, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Watch yourself, Carter. Making accusations like that could get you in even more trouble." Benny took another step forward, his whole body trembling with anger. "You ruined my life. You destroyed my business and now you're just going to walk away?" Anderson scoffed, shaking his head. "Looks like we've got ourselves a hothead, huh, Rick?" Before Benny could respond, one of the firefighters stepped between them, his expression stern. "Sir," he said to Benny, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to need you to step back. Let us handle this." Benny clenched his jaw, his fists still shaking, but he knew there was nothing he could do. He couldn't force them to admit what they'd done, couldn't make them pay for the loss they'd caused, not yet anyway. The firefighter gently steered him away, and Benny took one last lingering look at his restaurant, the place he'd built with his own hands, now reduced to a smouldering ruin. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. Benny stood in the smoky haze, watching the firefighters fight the flames that were now, thankfully, dying down. His restaurant, though, was nearly gone. Only charred walls and smouldering rubble remained. He tried to breathe steadily, to ignore the thick, acrid smell of burning plastic and grease that filled the air. Around him, people from the town had gathered, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking between him, the officers, and the smoking remains of Benny's grill. He caught sight of Officer Thompson and Officer Anderson, standing off to the side, still smirking, their casual demeanor a sickening contrast to the devastation around them. Benny felt a surge of anger so intense it almost frightened him, a deep, consuming rage that made his whole body tense. Unable to hold back any longer, he strode toward them, his hands still cuffed but his voice filled with fury. "You two," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You're responsible for this. You tore up my place and left it to burn, and now you're just standing there laughing about it?" Thompson turned to him, feigning surprise as he raised an eyebrow. "Is that right? You think you can go around accusing officers of the law just because things didn't go your way?" His smirk was as sharp as a knife, each word cutting deeper into Benny's rage. "You ruined everything," Benny spat, his voice rising despite himself. "This was my livelihood, my business, my family's future, and you just destroyed it like it was nothing." Anderson chuckled, folding his arms. "You're getting a little worked up, don't you think? Maybe you ought to calm down before you say something you'll regret." The gathered crowd was starting to murmur, people taking out their phones and recording as the confrontation escalated. Benny saw their faces, their expressions of shock, anger, and in some cases, quiet sympathy. He could feel the weight of their stares on him, but he didn't care. He needed to make these officers understand the damage they'd done. Benny took a step closer, his voice raw with emotion. "I lost everything because of you two, and you think I'm supposed to just stand here and take it?" Thompson's expression darkened. He looked around, seeing the crowd growing, the cameras pointed in their direction. His smirk faded, replaced with a look of cold, calculating anger. He stepped up to Benny, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're really pushing it, Carter. Don't think I won't haul you in right here and now." Benny's anger flared, the injustice of it all bubbling over. "Go ahead," he said defiantly, his voice steady. "I have nothing left to lose. You've taken it all." Thompson's face hardened. He glanced over at Anderson, giving him a barely perceptible nod. Without warning, Thompson reached forward, grabbing Benny by the arm. The crowd gasped, voices rising as people began to shout and protest. "What are you doing?" a woman in the crowd yelled, her voice filled with outrage. "He didn't do anything wrong." Benny tried to shake Thompson's grip, but Anderson stepped in, grabbing his other arm and forcing him toward the squad car. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct," Thompson announced, his voice loud and steady, as if he were making an example of Benny. "Disorderly conduct?" Benny shouted, struggling against their grip. "My restaurant's burning and you're arresting me?" But Thompson and Anderson ignored him, pushing him roughly toward the car. He glanced back at the crowd, at the people filming, their expressions of shock and anger giving him a small bitter comfort. At least they could see the truth, even if the officers couldn't. They shoved him into the back seat, slamming the door behind him. Benny's heart pounded as he sat there, hands still cuffed, the anger and frustration roiling inside him. He watched the crowd, watched the fire dying down as firefighters continued their work. His restaurant, his life's work, was gone. And now he was the one in custody. The drive to the police station was silent, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of the officers in the front seat. Benny leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the overwhelming sense of loss and anger that threatened to consume him. When they arrived at the station, Thompson and Anderson pulled him out of the car, leading him inside without a word. They pushed him into a holding cell, the cold metal bars clanking shut behind him. Benny stared at the floor, his hands still cuffed, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Once Thompson and Anderson left, the cell grew silent, pressing in around him like a weight. Benny sat on the hard bench, his hands resting in his lap, his mind numb with anger and exhaustion. But as the minutes passed, he found himself unable to sit still, shifting his hands, running his fingers over the rough marks left by the cuffs. How could it have come to this? How could they destroy his entire life's work and leave him locked up, as if he was the one who had done something wrong? His shoulders slumped as he leaned forward, his head in his hands. He thought about his restaurant, how every inch of it had been built with his own 2 hands, from the fresh coat of paint on the walls to the carefully placed kitchen shelves. It had been more than a business. It had been his dream, something he'd hoped to pass down to his daughter someday. She'd grown up there, playing in the back room while he worked, her laughter filling the air as she'd helped him set up for opening. He could still hear her voice, feel the pride he'd felt every time she'd looked up at him with a smile, telling him how she wanted to help, like Dad does. And now, thanks to 2 men who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience, that dream was nothing but smoke and ashes. How could they do this? How could, Benny wondered, the thought gnawing at him, how could they walk through his doors, tear everything apart and leave him with nothing? He'd spent years working to prove himself, to be seen, to rise above. He had been careful, always respectful, always bending to make himself more palatable to people who didn't want to give him a chance. And here he was, still the one behind bars, punished for standing up for himself. The bitter irony of it cut deep. He had been the one harmed, yet here he was alone in the place they thought he belonged. As he sat there, staring at the bars, he felt a deep, unfamiliar ache. This cell was a cage, just like the invisible walls he'd felt around him his whole life, walls built by people who would never let him belong, no matter what he did. But the ache was tempered by something else, a fierce determination, a quiet but unbreakable resolve. They had taken his business, his pride, and they thought they'd silenced him. But they'd misjudged him. They couldn't take his fight. They couldn't take his right to stand up and demand justice. Finally, after what felt like hours, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Benny looked up, his heart pounding as he saw a familiar figure approach his cell. Jamie Hughes, his lawyer, stood before him, her expression calm, but her eyes fierce. "Benny," she said, her voice steady, but filled with urgency. "Are you all right?" Benny shook his head, his voice hoarse as he spoke. "They destroyed my restaurant, Jamie. They tore it apart and then they just let it burn." Jamie's eyes hardened, her jaw tightening as she took in his words. "I know. I heard what happened. We're going to fight this, Benny. They can't get away with what they did." Benny looked at her, his expression bleak. "How, Jamie? How are we going to fight them? They're the police, and I've got nothing left." Jamie placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "We'll get you out of here first, and then we'll go after them. I've already filed the paperwork for your release. We're not going to let them bury this, Benny. We'll go to the media, file a lawsuit, get the whole town behind us. They'll have to answer for what they did." Benny nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of determination amid the anger and despair. He knew Jamie was right. He couldn't let them get away with this. They'd taken his restaurant, his livelihood, but he still had his voice, his fight. As Jamie left to finalize his release, Benny sat in the cell, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The anger he felt was no longer a wild, consuming rage. It was sharper now, focused, a weapon he would use to make sure Thompson and Anderson couldn't do this to anyone else. A few hours later, the cell door finally opened, and Jamie returned with the paperwork. Benny stood, his legs stiff from hours on the hard bench, but his resolve stronger than ever. "Let's go," Jamie said, her voice steady. "You're free to go for now, Benny. And tomorrow we start fighting back." Benny took a deep breath, nodding as he followed her out of the station. The weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy on him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them win. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in Jamie Hughes' office, casting soft, broken stripes of light across the papers spread out on her desk. Benny sat across from her, his posture tense, and his eyes still dark with the shadows of everything he'd endured. The night before had been a blur, with Jamie's firm assurance that they would take this fight public and pursue justice. But now, in the clear light of day, he could feel the weight of the coming battle settling in. Jamie glanced at him, her expression calm but focused. "First things first, Benny. I want to go over every detail with you. I need to know exactly what happened, from the moment they walked in until the moment they arrested you." She pushed a legal pad and pen toward him, inviting him to write down anything he might not say out loud. Benny nodded, swallowing back the anger that threatened to bubble up as he recalled each excruciating moment. "They came in claiming they had a tip about something illegal in my restaurant," he began, his voice steady but laced with bitterness. "I thought it was just a routine check, so I let them in, but they went straight to the kitchen, started tearing things apart, throwing things around, like they didn't care about anything but making a mess." Jamie scribbled notes, nodding as he spoke. "And when you tried to confront them?" Benny took a deep breath, steadying himself. "They told me to stay at the front, said they'd handle it, but I could hear them wrecking things, so I went back there, and they acted like it was all some kind of joke. Officer Thompson even said something about making sure I wasn't hiding anything. I told them to leave if they weren't finding anything. That's when they got aggressive." Jamie's pen moved quickly across the paper, her jaw clenched. "And the fire?" Benny's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know how it started, Jamie. I just know that the next thing I saw was smoke pouring out of my kitchen, and they were walking away, laughing. They let it burn, and they arrested me for disorderly conduct when I called them out." Jamie closed her notebook, looking at him with a determined glint in her eye. "Benny, we have enough here for a strong case. We can pursue multiple avenues. Damages for the loss of your business, punitive damages for the harassment, and criminal charges for the fire if we can prove they were negligent, or worse, deliberate. I've already spoken with a few witnesses who were at the scene and are willing to testify. Some even caught footage on their phones." The mention of witnesses sent a wave of relief through Benny. "So people saw. They actually saw what happened." Jamie nodded, her expression fierce. "Yes, and I'm going to make sure their voices are heard. We'll take this to court, but I want to do more. This isn't just about you, Benny. It's about making sure that officers like Thompson and Anderson are held accountable, that they can't just abuse their power without consequence." Benny felt a swell of gratitude toward Jamie, though he knew this road wouldn't be easy. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window, where he could see the people of the town going about their day unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He wondered if they would support him, or if they would see this as yet another attempt to undermine their police force, another excuse to ignore the real issues. Jamie interrupted his thoughts, her tone gentler now. "Benny, I need you to be prepared. This won't be simple. We'll face resistance, from the department, from people in the community who might not believe you, or who want to sweep this under the rug. But if we're going to do this, we do it the right way, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Benny nodded slowly. "I understand, Jamie. I'm ready. I'm not letting them walk away from this." She gave him a reassuring smile, pushing a file toward him. "Good. Now, let's start by reviewing what we've got. I want to go public with this, get the media involved. The more eyes on this case, the harder it will be for them to twist the story. People need to know the truth." Benny looked down at the file, the pages filled with his statements, photos of the restaurant's charred remains, and the testimonies from witnesses who'd been there. Each piece felt like a piece of armor, something he could use to shield himself against the storm he knew was coming. Just as Jamie began making calls to the media, the phone on her desk buzzed with a news alert. She glanced at her screen, her expression hardening. "Well, it looks like the officers are already trying to get ahead of this," she said, turning her screen toward Benny. There on a local news site was a headline that made Benny's blood run cold. "Officers deny accusations in alleged restaurant incident. We were just doing our job." Below the headline was a video of Thompson and Anderson standing together in uniform, their expressions somber and composed. Jamie pressed play, and Benny watched as Thompson began to speak, his voice firm and resolute. "These rumors are completely false. We were acting on a credible tip, following standard procedure to ensure the safety of the community. It's unfortunate that the community has chosen to interpret our actions this way, but we did nothing wrong. We certainly didn't start any fire. That's an outrageous claim." Anderson nodded solemnly beside him, adding, "We're professionals. Our duty is to protect and serve, and that's exactly what we were doing that day. We only wish everyone would see that and not try to twist the truth." Benny's hands tightened into fists as he watched, his pulse pounding in his ears. "They're lying," he said, his voice thick with anger. "They're standing there smiling and lying to everyone like it's nothing. Credible tip. That was just an excuse to trash my place." Jamie's expression was grim. "This is exactly what we expected. They're trying to paint themselves as innocent, responsible officers who are just doing their jobs. They know it's their word against yours, and they're betting on people trusting them because of those uniforms." Benny let out a shaky breath, feeling a renewed wave of rage. "They don't care at all, do they? They think they're going to get away with this like it's just another day on the job, and they're smiling through it, making it look like I'm the one in the wrong. Jamie placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. I know, Benny. I know how frustrating it is. But remember, we have evidence. We have witnesses who saw what happened and they're willing to testify. This interview only makes it clearer that they're trying to cover up what they did. Benny looked away from the screen, his jaw clenched, his heart heavy with the injustice of it all. They're going to make me out to be the bad guy, aren't they? They're going to twist this so everyone thinks I'm just some angry guy looking for trouble. Jamie's eyes softened. Maybe some people will think that, but we're not going to let their lies be the only story people hear. We'll make sure the truth is out there, Benny. This interview may enrage you, but in the end it's only going to strengthen our case. People will see through them. She reached for her phone again. I'm calling a reporter I know at the local paper, someone who isn't afraid to cover controversial stories. We'll set up an interview, get your side of the story out there. We need people to understand what happened, to see the faces behind this injustice. Benny felt his chest tighten. The thought of putting himself out there, exposing this raw wound to the world, was daunting. But as he glanced at Jamie's steady gaze, he felt a spark of strength. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for himself and for anyone else who had been silenced. Within hours, the first article was published. The headline bold and damning: Local business owner claims harassment and arson by police, a fight for justice. The article laid out every detail of Benny's experience, his words framed by quotes from witnesses who had seen the incident unfold. The image of Benny standing before his burned-down restaurant, the remains of Benny's grill smouldering in the background, was powerful, a stark contrast to the officer's dismissive statements. As the day went on, the story spread quickly. Benny's phone buzzed with messages of support from people he hadn't heard from in years, some from strangers who had seen the story online. The town was buzzing, conversations starting in coffee shops, workplaces, and homes. People were talking, and for the first time Benny felt the weight of his silence lifting. But not everyone was supportive. As the media coverage grew, so did the backlash. Online forums and social media were filled with heated debates, some people calling Benny brave, others accusing him of trying to smear the police. Local news stations picked up the story, each one painting a slightly different picture, some sympathetic, others questioning his motives. Benny's hands clenched every time he read a comment dismissing his experience, calling him a liar or worse, but Jamie reminded him to stay focused. They want you to react, Benny. They want you to be angry, to lose your composure. Stay calm. Let the facts speak for themselves. We have enough evidence to take this to court. We're going to make sure the truth comes out. As the court date drew nearer, Jamie worked tirelessly, compiling evidence, preparing witnesses, and meeting with supporters who wanted to stand by Benny. A small but growing group of townspeople began showing up to the hearings, holding signs and standing in quiet protest, their presence a symbol of support and solidarity. One evening, as they prepared for the trial, Jamie looked at Benny and said, "This is going to be tough. They're going to try to discredit you, make you seem irrational, angry. But I want you to remember why we're doing this. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been afraid to stand up. You're giving them a voice, Benny." Benny nodded, taking a deep breath. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but it was a weight he was willing to bear. The memory of his restaurant, the laughter of his daughter as she'd helped him open it, fueled him, giving him strength. This was his fight, and he wasn't alone anymore. As they entered the courthouse on the first day of the trial, Benny felt a calm determination settle over him. He glanced back at the supporters who had gathered outside, people from all walks of life, all races, standing in solidarity. Jamie gave him a nod, and together they stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The officer's arrogance had led them to believe he would stay silent, that he would cower and walk away. But they had miscalculated. Benny was ready to fight, and he wasn't going to let them win. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as people filed in, their eyes darting toward the front where Benny sat beside Jamie, his lawyer. Benny took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The weight of everyone's gaze felt heavy, but he knew he needed to be here to face this for his daughter, for his community, and for himself. Jamie leaned over, her voice calm but firm. "Remember, Benny, stay composed. We'll take this one step at a time. Let them dig their own holes." Benny nodded, glancing around the room. On the opposite side sat Officer Thompson and Officer Anderson, looking composed and confident, their faces devoid of the sneers and smirks he'd seen back at the scene. They wore the facade of respectable lawmen, the look carefully curated to project innocence. Benny's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. The judge entered, and everyone rose, the room falling silent. As the trial began, the prosecutor stood, introducing the case to the jury, laying out the charges against the officers: harassment, destruction of property, and negligence. The prosecutor's words were calm, methodical, each one painting a vivid picture of what Benny had endured. When it was Jamie's turn to make her opening statement, she stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the room. This case isn't only about the destruction of a business. It's about the abuse of power, about two officers who decided that they could disregard the rights and dignity of a hard-working man because they assumed no one would hold them accountable. Today we're here to prove that assumption wrong. Benny felt a swell of pride as Jamie spoke, her words clear and powerful. She looked back at him briefly, a nod of encouragement, before returning to her seat. The trial moved into the first round of testimonies. The prosecutor called Benny as the first witness. Benny took the stand, his hands gripping the edges tightly as he faced the judge, jury, and finally, Thompson and Anderson. He steadied himself, drawing strength from Jamie's presence and the knowledge that he was here to tell his truth. The prosecutor started with straightforward questions. Mr. Carter, can you tell us what happened on the day of the incident? Benny recounted the events calmly, each word carrying the weight of his experience. He described how the officers had barged into his restaurant under the guise of a tip, how they had trashed his kitchen, and, ultimately, how he had watched his business go up in flames while they laughed and walked away. He kept his tone steady, his voice unwavering, though he could feel the old anger simmering beneath the surface. And when you confronted them, what was their response? The prosecutor asked, leaning forward slightly. They told me to stay out of the way, Benny replied, his voice tight. They didn't want me there, didn't want me to see what they were doing. And when I finally went to check, they were tearing apart my kitchen, and then later, they just left. The fire started right after that. The jury listened intently, their eyes moving between Benny and the officers. Benny couldn't tell if they believed him yet, but he could see that they were at least paying attention, their expressions solemn as he continued his testimony. The prosecutor then moved on to the recorded footage taken by the bystanders. Jamie had warned Benny that the footage wasn't perfect, that it only captured parts of what had happened, but he felt a surge of hope as the prosecutor brought up the screen, preparing to play the clips. The video showed a shaky but clear image of Benny's restaurant, flames beginning to consume the building, while Officer Thompson and Officer Anderson stood to the side, laughing and smirking. Their expressions were unmistakable, even through the grainy footage, and the sound of their voices mocking Benny cut through the quiet of the courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the video ended. Benny glanced at the jury, seeing a few members shifting uncomfortably, their expressions tightening. Thompson and Anderson's faces remained stoic, but Benny could see a flicker of worry in Thompson's eyes. When the prosecutor finished, it was the defense's turn. Thompson's lawyer rose, his expression cool and composed as he approached Benny. Mr. Carter, the lawyer began, his tone dripping with a subtle condescension. Isn't it true that you were hostile to Officers Thompson and Anderson from the moment they entered your establishment? Benny held his ground. No, I wasn't hostile. I was confused and, yes, I was upset when they started destroying my kitchen. But I never threatened them, never tried to stop them until it was clear they weren't there to do any real investigating. The lawyer nodded, pretending to consider Benny's words. So you're saying they had no right to investigate after receiving a credible tip? I'm saying they didn't need to destroy my restaurant to investigate a tip, Benny replied, a note of frustration seeping into his voice. They didn't find anything because there was nothing illegal. They had no reason to tear apart my business. The lawyer smirked, turning to the jury. Isn't it possible that the fire was an unfortunate accident, something that happened after the officers left and had nothing to do with them? Benny's jaw clenched. Possible? Maybe, but they were the only ones who were in the kitchen, and when they left, they laughed and walked away. They didn't call anyone to check on the fire, didn't even try to help. The defense lawyer's smirk faded slightly, but he maintained his cool demeanor. He paced a few steps, glancing at the jury before looking back at Benny. Mr. Carter, isn't it also true that you were frustrated, possibly even angry with the officers for interrupting your business, that you might have, in the heat of the moment, interpreted their actions unfairly? Benny looked the lawyer directly in the eye, his voice steady. I was angry because they tore apart my life's work for no reason, because they treated me like I was a criminal, before they even walked through the door. I know what I saw, and I know what they did. The defense lawyer pressed on with similar questions, each one subtly trying to paint Benny as irrational, hostile, even paranoid. But Benny held his ground, refusing to let their tactics rattle him. He'd come too far to back down now, and he knew the truth was on his side. When the defense finally finished their cross-examination, Benny returned to his seat beside Jamie. She gave him a small nod, her expression reassuring. The trial continued with witness testimonies. Several people who had been outside Benny's restaurant that day took the stand, each one confirming parts of his story. The laughter they'd heard, the officers' dismissive attitudes, the moment Benny had been arrested while his restaurant burned. Each new voice strengthened Benny's case, building a picture of what had happened piece by painful piece. Finally, it was the officer's turn to testify. Thompson took the stand first, his face carefully arranged into a mask of professionalism. We received a tip about potential illegal activity in Mr. Carter's establishment, he began, his voice steady and calm. We followed protocol, performed a standard inspection, and left when we found nothing suspicious. Any suggestion that we started the fire is completely false. Thompson's lawyer asked him leading questions, each one designed to paint him as a responsible, law-abiding officer. Thompson's responses were precise, controlled, each word carefully chosen. He even glanced at the jury with a look of regret, as if saddened by the misunderstanding. But then Jamie rose and Benny watched as Thompson's carefully crafted demeanor faltered slightly under her sharp gaze. "Officer Thompson," Jamie began, her voice cool, "you claim you were just doing your job. Can you explain why the footage shows you and Officer Anderson laughing as Mr. Carter's business went up in flames?" Thompson's face twitched, his calm facade slipping for a moment. "I can't control how things look in a grainy video. We were joking about something unrelated." Jamie's eyebrows raised. "Unrelated? So you're saying it was just a coincidence that you happened to be laughing at the very moment Mr. Carter's restaurant was destroyed?" "Yes," Thompson replied, his voice defensive. "People interpret things the way they want to see them." Jamie pressed on, each question chipping away at Thompson's composure. She exposed inconsistencies in his story, subtle contradictions that made his credibility start to unravel. By the end of her questioning, Thompson's face was flushed, his answers terse and stumbling. Anderson's testimony went similarly, Jamie drawing out his frustration, his dismissive attitude, his reluctance to take any responsibility. By the time he left the stand, the jury's faces had hardened, their expressions grim. As the day drew to a close, Benny felt a renewed sense of hope. The officer's testimony had been weak, their lies clear to anyone paying attention. The weight of the truth was shifting, the momentum leaning toward justice. When court adjourned for the day, Jamie turned to Benny, her face lit with a quiet satisfaction. "We're making progress, Benny. The truth is coming out, and they're struggling to keep their lies straight." Benny nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint stirrings of relief. It wasn't over yet, but the truth was gaining ground, and he was finally beginning to believe that justice was within reach. The next day, Benny sat in the courtroom again, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he prepared for another grueling day of testimony. The previous day's progress had been encouraging, but he knew it wasn't over yet. The defense had fought hard to discredit him, painting him as just another angry business owner out to cause trouble, but Jamie had stood firm, and he felt a sense of determination he hadn't known he was capable of. As the judge entered the courtroom, Jamie leaned over to Benny, a subtle, almost excited glint in her eye. "We have a new witness," she whispered. "Someone came forward last night after seeing the news coverage." Benny looked at her, surprise flashing across his face. "A new witness? Who?" Jamie's smile widened. "A passerby who was waiting in the drive-thru when Officer Thompson was inside. She saw the whole thing through the window." After the formalities, Jamie stood and requested permission to call this witness, a woman named Lydia Grant. The defense exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this new turn. The judge nodded and Lydia entered the courtroom, a tall woman with a steady gaze and confident walk. She looked slightly nervous but resolute as she approached the stand, holding herself with quiet dignity. Once she was sworn in, Jamie began her questioning, keeping her tone gentle. "Ms. Grant, thank you for joining us today. Could you please tell us where you were on the day of the incident involving Mr. Carter's restaurant? Lydia nodded. I was at the drive-through window, parked and waiting for my order. I saw Officer Thompson enter the restaurant alone, while the other officer stayed outside. I didn't think much of it at first, but I could see everything through the window. Jamie nodded, glancing at the jury to ensure they were paying attention. Did you see anything unusual while Officer Thompson was inside? Lydia took a deep breath, her expression firming. Yes. At first it looked like he was moving things around, maybe inspecting. But after a while, I saw him being rough with some equipment near the stove. There was still some heat coming off it. I could see steam, so I figured it was still on. He pushed things off a shelf, and that's when I saw sparks and smoke. A murmur rippled through the courtroom and Benny felt his pulse quicken, his heart pounding with each word. This was exactly what he'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Jamie pressed on, her voice calm but intense. So you saw sparks and then smoke. What did Officer Thompson do? Lydia's eyes narrowed, her voice gaining strength. I thought he'd notice. The smoke started small, but it was growing, and I saw him look toward the door, almost like he was thinking about leaving. He walked toward the entrance, but before stepping outside, he looked back at the smoke and said, "If something happens, it's not my problem." He just walked away. Another ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Benny clenched his hands together, feeling a surge of anger and validation at the same time. Everything he'd felt, everything he'd known, was finally being confirmed. Jamie's gaze never left Lydia. And you're certain of what you saw and heard? Lydia nodded emphatically. Yes, absolutely. I even snapped a picture through the window. I just felt it was wrong the way he was acting, like he didn't care about the damage. Jamie's eyes brightened at the mention of the photo. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this photograph into evidence. The judge nodded, and Jamie handed the photo to the clerk. The image was displayed for the jury, showing a clear view of Officer Thompson inside the restaurant, looking back at the equipment as smoke began to rise. His posture was relaxed, with no sign of urgency or concern, even as the smoke began to billow around him. The defense attorney stood, his face a controlled mask of concern. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Grant's testimony is speculative. She wasn't inside the restaurant and couldn't possibly know the context of Officer Thompson's actions. The judge considered this briefly before turning to Lydia. Ms. Grant, please clarify. Did you hear any direct statements from Officer Thompson related to the fire? Lydia nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, I heard him say, "If something happens, it's not my problem." He was laughing like it was just a joke to him, and the smoke was getting thicker as he walked away. The judge allowed her testimony to stand, and the defense attorney sat down, visibly rattled. Jamie continued, her tone calm but pointed. Ms. Grant, thank you. I have one last question. Why did you come forward now? Lydia looked over at Benny, a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. I was scared to come forward because I know how powerful the police department is in this town, but I couldn't sit by and watch him lose everything when I knew what really happened. Officer Thompson was reckless. He saw the smoke, but he left, and it's not fair for Mr. Carter to pay for what Officer Thompson did. As Lydia stepped down, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of her testimony heavy in the air. Jamie glanced at Benny, giving him a reassuring nod. They had the proof they needed. The defense scrambled as they called Officer Thompson back to the stand, attempting to control the damage. Thompson's face was tense, his composure visibly shaken as he faced the jury once again. Officer Thompson, the defense lawyer began, his tone urgent, can you explain why Ms. Grant might have misinterpreted your actions? Thompson forced a weak smile, his voice strained. I don't know why she thinks she saw that. I was just doing my job. Inspecting as usual. I had no reason to believe there was a fire risk, and I left when the investigation was complete. But the confidence that had once laced his words was gone. The jury's faces were hard, some visibly skeptical as they listened. They had seen the photo, heard Lydia's words. Thompson's explanation felt hollow in comparison. When the judge called for a recess, Benny felt a surge of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. Lydia's testimony had shifted the scales, revealing Thompson's negligence in a way no one could ignore. As he and Jamie stepped outside the courtroom for a brief break, Benny turned to her, a faint smile breaking through the tension. Do you think it's enough? He asked, his voice filled with cautious optimism. Jamie gave him a firm nod. It's more than enough. They can try to twist the story, but the truth is out there now, and it's only going to get harder for them to cover it up. For the first time, Benny allowed himself to believe that justice was within reach. And as they prepared to return to the courtroom, he felt a renewed strength, knowing that this fight wasn't just his anymore. It was a fight for every person who had been wronged and deserved to see the truth brought to light. The courtroom was silent as the final arguments wrapped up. Jamie's closing statement had been powerful, painting a vivid picture of Officer Thompson's reckless actions and Officer Anderson's willful complicity in allowing the tragedy to unfold. These officers, sworn to protect and serve, disregarded their duty, showed reckless indifference and left a man's livelihood to burn, Jamie said, her voice resolute as she addressed the jury. They didn't just fail Benny Carter, they actively harmed him, laughing as they left his dream in flames. Today you have the opportunity to hold them accountable. The defense attempted to downplay their actions, insisting the fire had been a tragic accident, but the weight of the evidence against Thompson and Anderson was overwhelming. After closing statements, the jury filed out to deliberate. Benny sat quietly beside Jamie, his heart racing. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching like an eternity as he anxiously waited. This trial had become more than just a fight for his restaurant. It was a fight for justice, for his dignity, and for everyone who had been wronged by those in power. Finally, the jury returned, their faces somber but determined. Benny held his breath, his heart pounding as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. In the case of Officer Richard Thompson, we find the defendant guilty of gross negligence, misconduct, and reckless endangerment. Benny exhaled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. But there was more. In the case of Officer Chad Anderson, we find the defendant guilty of complicity in misconduct and reckless disregard for duty. Benny felt the weight lifting further, his mind finally absorbing what he'd longed to hear. Both officers were guilty. He looked over at Jamie, who gave him a reassuring nod. The judge cleared his throat, addressing Thompson and Anderson sternly. Your actions demonstrated a clear abuse of power, gross misconduct, and a reckless disregard for human life and livelihood. As officers of the law, you held a responsibility, not only to enforce the law, but to do so with integrity and care. You have failed this standard, and the consequences are clear. Turning to Thompson, the judge continued, Officer Thompson, you are sentenced to 3 years in prison for gross negligence and reckless endangerment, with eligibility for parole after 2 years. Thompson's face fell, his previously smug demeanor replaced by a look of shock and anger. The judge then turned to Anderson. Officer Anderson, while you were not directly responsible for starting the fire, you stood by and enabled a colleague's reckless actions. For your role, you are sentenced to 18 months in prison for complicity and reckless disregard for duty, with eligibility for parole after 12 months. Anderson looked down, his face pale, his earlier confidence shattered. Benny sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling over him. The prison sentences meant something real, something permanent. They were a validation of his fight, a confirmation that justice was at last being served. As the officers were led from the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted with a mix of applause and murmurs of approval. Reporters pushed forward, eager to capture the moment. Benny looked over the gathering of supporters, neighbors, and community members who had stood by him, each face a reminder of how important this battle had been. Jamie led him to the podium outside, where reporters were already waiting. Benny took a steadying breath before he spoke, choosing his words carefully. This verdict won't bring back my restaurant, and it won't erase what happened, he began, his voice steady and clear. But it shows that no one is above the law. It shows that those who abuse power, those who look down on others, will be held accountable. Today wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever felt powerless. It was about showing that justice is possible. The crowd broke into applause, and Benny felt a profound sense of relief and pride. This fight had been long, painful, and costly, but standing there, he knew he'd done the right thing. He'd refused to stay silent, refused to let injustice go unchecked, and now, with justice served, he felt ready to rebuild. As he walked away from the courthouse, Jamie by his side, Benny knew this was only the beginning. He would rebuild stronger, with a renewed sense of purpose and a voice that couldn't be silenced. A few weeks later, Benny stood in the office of his insurance agent, his fingers drumming the arm of his chair as he waited. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and community support, but now he faced one last step before he could truly begin to rebuild. He had been anxiously awaiting news on his insurance claim, hoping it would be enough to cover some of the damages and losses from the fire. The door opened, and his agent walked in with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, I have good news. Your claim was reviewed thoroughly, And considering the circumstances and the court ruling that we've approved a full payout, you'll receive the funds by the end of the week. Relief washed over Benny, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you. This means everything. It's a chance to get back on my feet. The agent nodded, extending a hand. You've been through enough, Mr. Carter. We're glad we could help make things right. Benny left the office with a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in months. The insurance payout would be a crucial step toward rebuilding, covering a good portion of the damage and allowing him to start planning again. But as he considered what lay ahead, he knew there was still a gap between what he needed and what he could afford. The next day, Benny sat in a small coffee shop, reviewing his notes for reopening when a man approached his table, his face friendly but unfamiliar. Mr. Carter, the man asked, extending a hand. My name is James Sinclair. I run a local foundation that supports small businesses, and I just wanted to say, your story resonated with me and many others. Benny shook his hand, nodding politely, though he wasn't sure where this conversation was headed. James smiled, taking a seat across from Benny. The community has rallied around you, and rightly so. You fought for justice, and now it's time to get your business back on its feet. I'd like to offer a donation to help you rebuild. Consider it a grant to cover the costs that insurance didn't. Benny felt his throat tighten, a mix of shock and gratitude filling him. I don't know what to say. This is more than generous. It's the least we can do. James replied warmly. People like you give others hope. We want to make sure